Camera angle and document setup. Okay, so we are going to talk about this. We're coming to an end in this lengthy guide, but there are 2 or 3 things I would like to mention before I let you go to create great comics. I've reserved these last sections to talk a bit about setting up the document for rendering and post-rendering effects. So let's talk about camera angle of view, which you can find on the draw palette. This is a single slider that can dramatically change the render of our model, but it can be overlooked sometimes. So that's in the draw menu. So we already talked about this a little bit here. We'll go back in here again. So here's our angle of view. In essence, it's a control that changes the angle of vision of the camera before flattening or exaggerating the perspective here. So if you turn perspective off, you're going to see, if we go here, usually, you know, the head is in the perspective is supposed to be bigger than the body here, or the shoulder at least. So if we turn perspective on, you're going to see, okay, now the head is bigger than the shoulder. If you want to exaggerate that effect, crank up that angle of view, and now the head is way bigger than the shoulder. You're also going to notice if you go to the left or to the right of your document, it's going to kind of change how much of that you see. If you do a line to object, it'll keep your perspective consistent, so you can kind of change that as well. I find it's extremely useful when you start to render different angles of your character to scene to tell your story. So setting up the document is really a matter of defining how big you want the output image to be and the dimension and the quality of the render. I usually start by resizing the document to something like 3000 by 2000 from the document palette, then just drag your tool out back to the canvas. So in order to do that, go to document here. Let's go ahead and just dock that over here. Dock the document palette, and we're going to go to if you turn off proportional, you can go in here and just type in, we're going to go 3000 by 2000, hit enter, and then hit resize. It's not undoable. Do direct resize the document, hit yes, Control N to clear a canvas. Then you can drag your model back out. If it does this, hit Control N to clear it again. Go to drag dots and then drag rect again, and you'll go ahead and have that. Go into edit mode. Hit F to frame and you've got your object. Now, your document is huge and it's not showing, because right now, if we go into our document, is already docked over here. If we go to actual, this is the actual settings here. If we want to, we can zoom out, and now you can see how massive our document is. So the reason we're making our document really big is so when we export this, it's going to be 3000 pixels of information wide by 2000 tall. So you're going to want to zoom out, and now you can frame your object. And you're going to notice it's going to start chugging, slowing down a little bit, and that's because it's having to draw a lot more pixels. But when you go into Photoshop, you'll have a lot more information to work with. He also likes to set the SPIX subpixel slider to the maximum of 7 to get better anti-aliasing. And you can also do anti-alias half, and that'll kind of get you a preview of what it would look like after you go ahead and hit the SPIX and do anti-aliasing. But if you want to, you can do actual zoom out, and then you can hit this BPR render. So the SPIX is a subpixel anti-aliasing render quality. It'll increase the time of your render. So for demo purposes, I'm probably going to turn that down to 0. But for while you're working, just crank that up, and that'll go ahead and give you really nice anti-aliasing on your lines. Although rendering is a key word in the name of this guide, we haven't discussed it much. The only reason why this section is so small compared to the other chapters is because we barely need to render to achieve a comic look. The preview is almost as good and enough in most cases. So why render if what we see is pretty much as good as we want to get? A couple reasons. Using the BPR render, we can take advantage of all the passes that can be generated from a single click, like mask, depth, shadows, AO, SSS, etc. These are extremely useful if you want to compose or edit your image later on in Photoshop. As part of the advantages of rendering in passes, we can also apply filters and adjustments based on those passes to enhance the comic look or to change it completely. Let's say you want to render this Kepler character and do a bit of post-rendering effects. Open up the render palette. Let's go ahead and do that. So render palette open. And expand the render properties and BPR renders pass subpalettes. So render properties and then BPR render pass here. In the render properties, you can select what passes you want to generate. I generally turn on the shadows and AO occlusion, but in this comic style, I prefer to create the shadows using a matte cap like we did on the comic material. So basically, when we go in here to our light and we move this around and then we hit BPR render, depending on where that light is shading, where that light is casting, it'll drop in a cast shadow from your light. So see how that shadow goes here? The cool thing is, at the end of the BPR render pass, that's a separate pass. So in Photoshop, you can make that a different color, you can make that a different opacity, and you can just layer that into your comic book for effect. There's your depth pass. If you want to do a lens blur in Photoshop, there's your mask. We don't have ambient occlusion turned on, but if you want to, just go to your render properties, turn on AO occlusion, and then if you want to change any of these settings, go down here to the BPR AO and shadow pass here, and you can change these settings. I go over this stuff more in detail if you go to my YouTube channel here. I think it's an Intro to ZBrush Part 3, and actually those are available on my Gumroad and ZBrush, but you can kind of see the sample videos in Intro to ZBrush Part 2 and 3. Intro to ZBrush Part 1 is free, so you can download those on ZBrush or Gumroad, and you can also just play them here on YouTube. But Intro to ZBrush Part 3, we get a little bit more in depth on render passes and what to do, but we're going to go over a little bit of that today. So hit the BPR button to create all of your passes. Render shouldn't take long, but it'll depend on the settings you choose for each pass. Each one is finished, and you can export each pass to a PSD file. So when you click on these, that'll go ahead and export a PSD of your BPR render, for example. If you want a bit more in-depth explanation on the rendering passes, you can download the Guide to ZBrush Skin Material and BPR Rendering and the Wet Clay and Rendering tutorial on the ZBrushGuides.com. Filters and adjustments. Finally, we have the BPR filters and adjustments. I just want to mention these briefly as these extra tools that ZBrush offers because they can modify your render quite a bit. So after you hit BPR and you go all the way down, oh, I forgot we turned AO on. You know what, let's go ahead and just for demo purposes, I can turn AO off. We don't need an AO pass in here, but we will render a shadow pass just for fun. So go all the way down to the bottom here and you're gonna see a BPR filters. So now let's play with a little bit of these filters here. There are up to 27 types of effects you can add to these 12 filters right here. To use them, turn on the selected ones, similar to how we turn on and off the channels in the quad shader material, and select the type of filter from the drop-down menu. So in order to see this filter, go ahead and just click this little open button here, and you can see this filter is set to noise by default. You can choose a blending mode for each filter individually and play with the sliders to determine how the filters is masked and applied to the entire document. So as you're adding more filters, you can use blending here. Noise maker, edit noise, and you can tell I don't come in here very often, but you can blend between these things here. Oh, there it is. So there's the blend mode, and there's the color, the black that's selected by default. So you can change the blend mode if you want to do like multiply this noise, or I think replace is by default here. And then let's go ahead and change it to maybe screen. There we go. So with screen selected, it'll put the noise all over here. So just change the blending noise here. You can choose the amount of noise that you have, and also the opacity of that noise, for example. And let's go ahead and just change that back to replace here. So back to our noise here. These are my favorite filters used in render comic style. So noise is a great way to get a more papery look and to give some textures to the colors here. Sharpen, and let's go ahead and change this color. Let's turn this Colorize off, and we'll go ahead and choose like this kind of dark desaturated blue here. There we go. And let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger here. Oh, and you know what? We still have this massive document size. What I'm going to do is, just for our purposes here, I'm going to do W size new document. No, I don't want to save changes. And then I'm just going to drag that back out and hit F, so it'll run a little bit faster. It won't tax my machine quite so much. Not that it's a big deal. It's doing fine. And now we can kind of just see a little bit more. So now that we've moved this, our filters have disappeared. So we got to hit BPR again. And now our noise came back, and now we can just apply these. So if we want to have, we'll go ahead and keep the noise, and then we'll go over here to F2. And instead of blur here, so we can get that blur, we can kind of just start blurring this out. Instead of blur, we're going to go ahead and change this to sharpen. Sharpen helps sharpen the transition between the colors and define the outlines a bit better. Adaptive, I find this filter useful to create extra sense of depth. Driven by the depth slider and a bit of radius, you can create a foggy render. So let's change this filter. We got the sharpen here. Let's go ahead and go to F3. And this one's set to sharpen again, so we'll just do adaptive, additive, sorry. Use the additive filter to create access to depth by the depth slider here. So here's depth and a bit of radius. So you can kind of, you know what, let's put this down here so we can kind of see the top of his head here. Do another BPR. And now with the depth slider and radius, you can kind of dial that in to kind of get a little bit more of a foggy look, and you can kind of dictate, and it's using that depth pass here. So if you go in here and you hover over this, you can see there's a mask from white to black. For the closer it is to the camera, the farther away it is to the camera. So the depth is using that mask to kind of dial in that effect here. Paint, with this filter, you can add a bit of extra shading or a gradient across the whole model, particularly useful when using the cavity and depth slider here. So let's go ahead and change this to paint, see if we can get that to work. And I haven't played a bunch with these, so feel free to go in here and obviously play with these settings here. Paint color, so you can go down here to the color here. Let's do like an orange here, and then the radius and the depth here. And this is still looks foggy, like it's additive, but it's filter, play, paint. And you can go change the blend modes here. There might be better blend modes depending on what you're trying to use here. So replace, if we do like maybe screen, I don't know. Play with these colors and also play with the depth and also play with the radius and see if you can get that to kind of work. Obviously I haven't done that a whole lot. Reflect self, reproduce an effect that is weird enough to be interesting, useful. So you can kind of reflect yourself, and that might be that one. This might be the paint one. This might be reflect self. Negative is not a must-have filter, so play with that one a little bit. And also, if you have the adjustments at the bottom of the render palette. So if we go all the way down here, while you got this BPR going, you can go down here to adjustments, and instead of doing all of these things in Photoshop, you can turn on adjustments, and now you can kind of crank up or crank down the contrast here. So we can kind of crank that up if we want to, and then you can go here to brightness, and there's also these levels down here, these curves down here, so you can go through here. I'm assuming these are just contrast RG and B, if I had to guess. Yeah, there we go. So you can kind of play with these contrast sliders to kind of get you a little bit of a different look. Another filter you can use underneath the BPR filters here, if we change this from paint to posterize, so you know the posterize filter you have in Photoshop, you can go ahead and, we're kind of layering it over here. So the radius, we probably want to just turn that back down to 1, and then the depth we can probably leave alone. But then you can go through here and posterize in ZBrush instead of posterizing in Photoshop, so you can kind of just play with that and kind of get that look you're going for here. That's it. This turned out to be a long tutorial, but I think we've covered all the essential bits. I hope I've shed light on the process of creating comic style renders in ZBrush and BPR. If you've learned something, I hope you can share with me some of the things you make with the help of this tutorial. I'd love to see what you can come up with. If you have any questions, feel free to ask my Facebook page. Cool. Feel free to share this tutorial with anyone you want. Just please share the download link so they can download it themselves, which if you look on your screen, you can go and download that. Facebook. This is Pablo Munoz Gomez. Check out his website. A lot of really cool tutorials on there. And then here's the step-by-step guide how he created this cover here, which you can kind of see all the processes. Very cool, like pulp cover magazine there. Another thing you wanted me to bring up is the use of light to kind of blow out highlights as well. So if we go over here to the light menu here and we change this light direction, let's go ahead and go back to our poly paints off. Let's go to mRGB, color, fill object. Oh, these are matte caps. Material, comic style rendering. We'll go back to the super comic here. And now if we change the light, where you can kind of see the shadows here. This light intensity right now is set to 2. So as you crank this down, you'll dial in, and the poly paint's on here. So you can kind of just, it's got some light blue on here. You can use the light direction to kind of dictate where the shadows go, as well as you can kind of use the light to kind of blow out. So here, so you can kind of just turn the lights down to kind of dial in that look as opposed to going to your material settings, or you can crank it up to like 10 and that'll just kind of blow out your highlights as well. Distance, 100, and you can also go in here to the light. So the light caps we've already gone over. Light shadow, you can kind of play with the shadows in here. You can also play with the light properties and the light type. There's the light type. So right now it's set to sun. You can also set it to radial to kind of get a different kind of look, depending on what you're going for here. You can do a spotlight, a point light, a glow, and kind of give you a different effect. There's the sunlight, so it's kind of blown out here. So you can kind of use your lights as well as your ambient here. If you turn your ambient down or turn your ambient up, it'll kind of start dialing in those back face shadows, so you can kind of change those properties as well. All right, I think we're good. Can you use the Photoshop export that came from Posterize? Thanks for bringing that up. So yes, if you go in here to Z plugin, let's go ahead and load up our streaming comic rendering resources. Here's our Kepler bust here. We're going to go ahead and in this material just grab his super comic shader here. So we've got our comic book guy here, and then we go in here to BPR render, and then we've got our render settings we've already gone over. So render properties, BPR render pass. So here's all our render passes. You can also use this new plugin they have. So Z plugin in ZBrush to Photoshop. You can use ZBrush to Photoshop to send all of your render passes that you've got selected here to Photoshop. It'll pack it into a Photoshop PSD. If you want more information on how to use this, just click the ZBrush to Photoshop CC. It'll kind of walk you through all the different steps and functions that this thing has. And then you can use ZBrush to Photoshop CC to go ahead and send that all over to ZBrush in one nice compact little, netpack little way.